Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A shout out to viewers watching this over Zoom and also Facebook Live. Now, welcome to our first webinar this year. Let's Talk, a webinar series organized by Consumer Associations of Singapore, CASE for short, where we discuss key consumer issues. Now, my name is Linus and I'm your moderator for today's discussion. Now, today we have here to have a topic that many Singaporeans are concerned with: rising costs of living, GST increase, and what consumer trends can we expect to see in 2023? Now, first of all, let me just introduce to you all our panelists for today. Now, joining us in the studio today, we have Eunice Quek, food correspondent with Straits Times. Eunice has 7 years of experience being a food correspondent and a total of 13 years of being a journalist. All right. Now, we have also our panelists joining us virtually today. We have Associate Professor Walter Theseira from the Singapore University of Social Sciences. Professor Walter has been an academic professional for 14 years. Last but not least, of course, we have Mr. Erik Wang, Chief Executive Officer of Chang Cheng Group. A warm welcome to our panelists and thank you for your time out in joining us for today's discussion. Now, the current issue that we are facing is, of course, we all know, the rising cost of living and the inflation as the main concerns. Now, inflation in Singapore is expected to remain elevated in the first half of 2023 before softening in the second half of the year. Now, this says the Minister of State for Trade and Industry, Mr. Alvin Tan, on Tuesday. Now, as you might already know, Singapore's core inflation remains unchanged at 5.1% in December, average 4.1% for 2022. Now, all items inflation in Singapore for 2023 is projected to come in at 5.5% to 6.5%, compared to 6.1% in 2022. Now, to understand more about this issue of the rising cost of living, let me just raise this question to Prof. What do you think are the factors affecting this rising cost of living? What is the impact of such rising prices on Singaporeans?
Well, I think for the factors, there are these three major causes of the rising cost of living, not just in Singapore, but also globally. Probably one of the most important factors is the Ukraine war, which has affected supply chains globally. And I think a lot of people are surprised by that because they think this conflict is happening, in the middle of Europe. What does it have to do with Singapore? But actually, both Ukraine and Russia are actually some of the largest suppliers of many key commodities and agricultural products globally. And due to the war, basically the sources of supply from these regions have been cut off either by the conflict or by sanctions, for example, applied to Russia. And because of that, there's been a lot of supply chain disruption resulting from the war, which is flowing through to prices here as well. Then the other broad cause would be the global supply chain crisis, which has been going on for a number of months. It's only now starting to ease. And the global supply chain crisis has mainly been caused by the very uneven and unpredictable post-COVID recovery of many economies. I mean, the good part there is that many economies, including Singapore, have actually rebounded strongly after they eased off or ended COVID restrictions. The bad news is because they rebounded so strongly and quickly, supply chains in many cases couldn't keep up with demand associated with the reopening. And that has also translated to higher prices. Then finally, domestically, Singapore has actually enjoyed quite a strong post-COVID economic recovery because our reopening has been quite quick and our demand has also grown quite rapidly because of that. But that's a good thing, right? Because the economy is doing well, people have jobs and so on. But the bad thing is there's a lot of pressure, on the prices for goods and services. And the result of all of this has been a lot of inflation is imported. We basically import pretty much everything we eat or consume in Singapore. So that's part of the cause of inflation. The other part of it is domestic, which is the pressure on goods and services, due to high local demand associated with our robust recovery. Okay, so now moving on to the impact on Singaporeans. Actually, the problem of inflation is not whether prices go up or not. Prices go up all the time, pretty much. It's about whether the rise in prices is so rapid that the economy gets destabilized, whether the rise in prices runs ahead of people's wages. And I think on this front, the impact has not been as bad as it might be. So if you look at the effect of price changes in the economy, so far, these changes have been manageable by a lot of businesses. Okay, so we are not in an inflation, we're not in an environment of hyperinflation. There are economies out there who are seeing price changes 10 to 20% a month. Now, when you have that kind of price change, you have hyperinflation. It's very bad for the economy because you're always having to change your prices. Consumers and business partners don't know what to expect. People don't want to make investments. But Singapore is very far away from that. In Singapore, over the past year plus or so, yes, many businesses have changed prices and raised prices, but they have not had to do so, every month or every other month. They've been able to cope with just maybe one or two rounds of price changes. Then on the consumer side, the most recent wage growth data shows that at least towards the end of last year, wages were able to keep ahead of inflation. Now, we don't have the data coming in yet for this year and so on, but I'm hopeful that wages will keep pace with inflation. And what it means is, although the prices go up, it will not result in hardship for many consumers. But what we do have to watch out for is consumers with low income, consumers on fixed income like the elderly. Those are people who don't have a lot of room to respond, in terms of their wages to inflation. So those we have to pay extra attention to.
Great. Thank you so much, Prof. Now, well, we have heard, now you know, fortunately, no hyperinflation yet. Yes, that's good news. Now, of course, a lot of us will look towards the government for help, and I can see that the government has actually done a fair bit to cushion. Now, last year, the government has actually announced measures such as the assurance package, the CDC vouchers to support Singaporeans. Now, Eunice, how do you think these initiatives by the government has helped Singaporeans?
Well, I think the vouchers definitely help with mitigating, the cost of essentials, whether it's groceries at the supermarkets, it can be your daily meals, your haircuts, and it should help consumers still go about their daily lives without feeling too much of a pinch on the daily, on all the rising costs. If I continue my life as per normal and I don't really feel anything, I can still use the vouchers. I think that's very well managed.
That's $300 per household, right?
Yeah, I believe so, yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. Now, as a food correspondent with the Straits Times, now you'll be in touch with, of course, the hawkers and the store operators on the ground. Now, I envy your job, right? But how do you think this has helped hawkers and store operators?
Well, as long as consumers don't stop spending, right, and if they have the voucher to do so, whether or not they use the vouchers at all, and I believe that would actually be the most beneficial to hawkers and the store operators, and also in turn they can also perhaps use these vouchers to defray their own food cost.
So, for those out there who has yet to redeem your vouchers, please go and do this. Well, if the so-called Akong or Zeng Hu is giving you money, please make good use for yourself and for those store operators as well. So it's a win-win situation. Now, okay, on a daily basis, consumers can choose to purchase house brands, which is cheaper, or which is of course a cheaper alternative instead of what we know as the popular or well-established brands. Now, consumers may also wish to use application or group chats to share and check price comparisons. Now, this is when case on our own, we actually have what we call an app called the Price Kaki. Now, consumers, this is spelled as price, Price, Kaki, Kaki. All right, so this is when I've got friends who ask me, how do you spell Kaki? Is it the color or is it, Kaki is actually basically friends. So it's friends of prices or price friends, So Price Kaki itself, it's a very interesting app that we have developed and since last year, and we have 125,000 downloads. Now that's a lot for a price app, but be the 125,000 plus one, please. Okay. Now, For this price kaki, what can they do? Now, consumers can actually compare prices at home before going out to your supermarkets. Price kaki lets you search and compare over how many? 10,000, right? 10,000 products, including grocery items from major supermarket retailers and, of course, your favorite hawker center. Now, the list itself goes on, and in fact, during the past Chinese New Year, we have over 500 Chinese New Year products that are listed on Price Kaki. So if you have got a need to eat your bak kwa, or if you want something, maybe your pineapple tarts, you should have consulted the Price Kaki for value for money. Now, on this topic, we have our strategic partner, which is Chang Cheng, and represented by Mr. Erik Wang here. Now, Chang Cheng has been a strong supporter of our case Price Kaki and added its food courts and the coffee shops for comparison on Price Kaki. Now, Erik, just wondering, why did Chang Cheng take this approach, and how has it impacted Chang Cheng? Are there any initiatives that Chang Cheng has launched in regards to the rising cost of living?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. For those of you who are not familiar with Chang Cheng, I'll just briefly give a description of what Chang Cheng does. Chang Cheng is an integrated food company. So we do upstream from upstream, all the way we involve with vegetable farming, or to central procurement, central kitchen, food distribution, operating of coffee shops, and then also stores. So we do end-to-end for in food manufacturing and distribution. Now, the reason why we participated in the initiative for Price Kaki is that our industry, particularly for Chang Cheng, we are a price taker. We have never been, in a position where we can actually influence price. So we take the market price, and we work our best to reduce our costs such that we will be competitive. Now, so for one, we want to, know for ourselves that we are doing it well, we are doing it right. So we put our price out into the public for them to make the comparison, to know that we have been able to compete with our peers. But more importantly, also for internally, my team to be able to know how well we have performed and how much room from our end that we can still be able to reduce our cost, so that we will be able to further reduce our selling price. Ultimately, Chang Cheng wants to provide affordable meals to as many people as possible. So we work very hard to ensure that our costs we are able to maintain a very competitive cost structure. So among the things that you talked about, what are the initiatives that Chang Cheng recently pushed out to help with the managing of cost increases? We have launched a halal version of the Rice Garden, which is another project that we have previously worked with Food Fair to provide affordable meals to the masses. Chang Cheng is one of the leading players to provide mixed rice to the public under the Chang Cheng umbrella, Chang Cheng brand. But we also work with Food Fair to provide the same offerings under the umbrella of Rice Garden, which is a branding that Food Fair used to promote really competitively priced mixed rice. For example, a standard 2 vegetable and 1 meat rice, mixed rice, is offered at about $3.50 at Chang Cheng. But at Rice Garden, due to the price control, we will be selling between $2.50 to $3. So that will allow us, or for us to try to sell to a greater number of people, but keeping a very thin margin, and hopefully be helpful to as many people as we can. So we have launched a new halal version of that rice garden known as Barong, and we are glad to report that it's been quite successful in Senja Hawker Center. The idea is to launch it to as many hawker centers as possible. So we have 2 to 3 more in the pipeline. The target between Food Fair and us, as well as our commitment to NEA, would be to try to have it at 50 of the hawker centers in Singapore.
Now, we certainly look forward to this expansion of the number of outlets and, of course, the strategic market operators that can come on board. Basically, is to have more competitive pricing and ultimately to, like what you have said earlier, to have affordable meals for consumers. Now, just wondering, Eunice, apparently Price Kaki now, we're going to have a new feature that actually allows consumers to compare unit pricing for some of these goods. Well, do you think unit pricing will allow consumers to stretch their dollar?
Yes, definitely it will help to stretch the dollar. And I understand this price kaki thing, it makes a lot of sense to me because it's what we do when we do a lot of price comparisons in our stories and all that. And sometimes people think, oh, just because something seems more expensive, that doesn't mean that it's, if you do the unit pricing, it actually helps to break down how much something costs. So it makes the most sense, I feel, for people who are buying in bulk. You want volume and all that. And like if you have a big family, it makes the most sense to look at the different unit pricing so that you know exactly how best to maximize,
like
right,
a true apple for apple comparison.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because sometimes you can't really tell. You just assume that something's like $1.20. Maybe you actually get more than the one that is $1, right? But you just assume, oh, the one that's for $1 is cheaper. So it helps that at least with Price Kaki, you do the homework for us, right?
Well, the thing
Because
is
that's what we spend half the time doing.
in fact, I must say, well, we have got Price Kaki ambassadors that will be doing most of the homework on the ground. But we'll be launching this shortly. Like I say, akan datang. Okay, watch the space, and you can actually have an influence on how pricing and how consumers cope with your rising cost of living. You have the power in your hands, actually. Okay, now the thing is that we are moving on to the second part of our segment, which is basically on GST. Now, of course, the plan to raise GST has started this year on 1st January, and GST has been around since 1st April 1994 at a rate of 3% at a time. Now, gradually, we know it has increased over the years, and soon it would have become 8% like what we currently have now. Now, just wondering, why does GST have to increase? Now, before that, I would like to ask Prof, why does GST exist in the first place? Now, what is the purpose? Your thoughts, please, Prof.
Well, we have a tax system that is designed to spread this burden of paying tax over different groups in the society and the economy. And we have got income tax, personal income tax for corporations and individuals. We've got property taxes and stamp duty. So GST is actually just one part of this entire tax system. And because GST exists, it means that we do not have to pressure other taxes like income or corporate taxes even further. In fact, when GST was first introduced, actually other taxes were reduced because the entire aim of introducing GST was to spread the burden of taxation more widely. Today, for example, GST collects enough money such that if we want to remove GST entirely, we actually have to double some of these other taxes. You have to double your income tax if you wanted to remove GST entirely in order to make up the difference. Or we would have to start raising some of these other taxes by quite a large amount to make up for not increasing GST. So as for why we are increasing GST, I think the finance minister, DPM Wang, he has talked about this many times before. We do need to prepare for some of our future spending needs on the aging population. And one of the reasons why we are putting a bit more of the revenue share on GST is that unlike an income tax, GST is actually less likely to drive out investment in business. And that's very important because when you raise income taxes, whether it's personal or business, you have to keep in mind your international competitiveness because people are looking at Singapore, but they're also looking at places like Hong Kong. And they will ask themselves, why should I put my business in Singapore instead of Hong Kong? Okay. And one of the reasons is because we're competitive on tax. So it's very important not to drive out this investment in business because we need them here. So we've got this bigger economy. Without the bigger economy, we cannot support our elderly. We cannot pay for the social spending we need. Now, of course, GST is a tax a lot of people are not happy with. Many people say, look, okay, you can have GST, but why is it that you want to charge GST on everyday necessities? Why is it that you want to charge it on the kinds of things that retirees, low-income Singaporeans buy? And I think the government does recognize that complaint. That is why we have got this permanent GST voucher scheme. The aim of that voucher scheme is to refund to lower-income Singaporeans quite a large part of what they are paying in GST. And once you conduct the refund exercise, in the end, it will be the higher income Singaporeans. It'll be the foreigners, the tourists and so on spending money here. They're the ones who are paying the bulk of our GST in the end. Now, of course, there are some other choices you could make. So some people say, look, okay, fine, you keep the GST, just exempt the everyday things I buy from GST. The challenge there is that it can be quite complex to determine what is a necessity, what is not a necessity. So obviously, a lot of people are thinking rice is a necessity, right? So why don't we exempt that? But I went to the supermarket recently. I look at the kinds of rice that you can buy, and there are so many kinds, right? Is it that I'm supposed to exempt all rice? If that is so, then should I exempt this Japanese rice, which, as everybody knows, costs many times the standard Thai rice, right, from GST? So there's a lot of complexity in the system of exemption. Instead, what we have is a system of giving the money back to lower income consumers. So I think GST is obviously not a perfect tax, but we have to look at it in the context of the overall tax system. We also have to consider what the government does to try to reduce the impact of GST on lower income Singaporeans.
Thank you, Prof. Now, what we've heard from Prof, basically GST is very much consumption-based. It's a broad-based tax system that, it doesn't drive out investors. I think that's important for investors in business. We need the jobs. We need them to come in. And as a result, you will have to be responsible for our own consumption. So consumers, we urge that you be responsible as responsible consumers and based on your consumption, and it is in your hands as to how much you consume and how much you have to pay GST. Not because GST is government say tax, it's basically goods and services tax, all right? Now, we have seen that some supermarkets or retailers, in fact, have actually started absorbing GST to help consumers adapt to this change. Now, Eunice, do you think that this has any impact on helping consumers, and why?
Of course, it helps, to make an impact on consumers, but whether they feel it or not, I think it really depends on how long retailers can do this. I honestly don't expect them to do this for a very long period of time. And then when GST hits, 9% next year, well, then what's going to happen then? Will they also continue to absorb the extra cost? Will there be more vouchers to help mitigate this as well? At this point, I think the impact now for the vouchers is fine, but it's really a long-term thing, right? Like, where does this cost go? And how businesses will be affected if they continue to absorb the cost. But I thought one good way of how some supermarkets, they brought down their costs was when there was this big push for house brands around like last year, and we wrote a lot of stories about that, because they offer quality but at a reasonable price. And I do think that made an impact on consumers last year because they recognized the value in that, and hopefully it will continue.
Now, what else do you think can be done to actually help F&B operators and consumers cope with rising prices and this adjustment to this GST increase?
Well, of course, I mean, more money helps, right? So any form of subsidies, rebates, for F&B operators will help, whether so if it's not for cost of ingredients, maybe it can be absorbing costs for, say, cleaning or, packaging, right, my tapao boxes and all that, utilities or, even those that are on food delivery, all the other, right, because unfortunately, rising food prices, are not the only things that F&B operators have to worry about. So they have to deal with manpower, they have to deal with rent, and all that is very likely to go up as well. So all these extra costs, if there's any way, in any form of package, right, perhaps, that can be helped, okay, it would definitely make a huge difference for sure. Yeah.
Sure. And I hope the finance ministry people are actually listening into this. This is probably the wish list, from the ground as to what the next budget is coming out in the next week itself. So, yes, let's watch the space and let's see whether the wish will come true for us. Now, for Prof, what are your thoughts on this? What else do you think could be done to help consumers cope with these rising prices and adjustments to this GST increase?
Okay, well, first, I think many people are concerned about the impact of the GST increase on cost pressure, on prices. But the direct impact of the GST increase is actually going to be quite small. On average, it will be less than 1% with the 1% with the GST increase. And the reason why the actual impact of prices will be lesser than 1% is because the businesses, when they face the GST increase, they have to weigh whether they will lose customers due to passing it on. In some cases, they can pass it on, the entire 1%. In other cases, they will be worried about their market position and they will pass on less than 1%. Now, of course, you might say, what am I talking about? I just went to the coffee shop or whatever, and I saw the prices went up by much more than 1%. They went up by 10, 20 cents or whatever, right? So we all are used to seeing the prices jump by much more than 1%. But actually, what is going on there is that businesses are using the GST increase as a very convenient time to actually make all of the price adjustments they already wanted to make for some time because they are facing other increases in costs. We heard about the manpower costs going up, rental costs, all sorts of costs have gone up. So the businesses are just using this particular time to just do all the price changes at once because they consider that easier than changing prices by a small amount, every few months and so on. Okay, then we can think about, given the cost pressure, given GST and so on, what do we expect the government to do about this? I think the key here is that from the economics perspective, it does not make sense for a government to protect consumers against all of the price changes that we are experiencing. The reason is this: the biggest factor driving the price changes in Singapore is the supply chain for all of these things that we import and consume has actually gotten more costly. And when the supply chain gets more costly, what you have to do is you have to look for cheaper options, right? Everybody has to look for cheaper options. The businesses and the supply chain must look for cheaper options. The consumers have to look at what they're consuming and decide, should I go to something cheaper instead? Now, when we have excessive government subsidy, the problem is all of us stop looking for cheaper options when the prices go up. And this is actually not sustainable in the long run. You look globally, who are the countries who are committing to a lot of consumer subsidies? There are generally two kinds of countries. There are countries with some kind of source of revenue which does not depend on their competitiveness. So here I'm talking about for example, Middle Eastern countries who get to generate a lot of wealth from just digging oil out of the ground. But Singapore is not like that. We don't have a magical source of wealth we can dig out of the ground. The other kind of country, I would say, are the countries who are going to be in a lot of fiscal trouble very soon because they are on an unsustainable spending path. Things look good at the moment, but as things progress, they end up basically having to borrow money, even go bankrupt as a country, and then that is good for nobody. Okay, so Singapore, I think, has a better strategy, which is that we try to focus help on the lower income groups out there. We give more cash, we give more vouchers to the lower income consumers, and we let them decide, how do I spend this extra cash in my pocket? How do I use it to, protect against the price increases? For higher income consumers, I think, all of us, we have to decide, how do we prioritize our spending when prices go up? Okay. If you're a high income consumer and you tell the government, look, I want you to protect us against inflation, I don't care what. Well, the unfortunate thing is you're going to have to pay more taxes so that the government can pay out more subsidy. And I think in the end, you would prefer to make your own choices with your own money. So it's better to have lower taxes and not to be protected directly by the government against price changes.
Thank you, Prof. Now, putting the same question to Erik, what else do you think could be done to help consumers cope with rising prices and these adjustments to the GST increase?
For one, I believe any form of transfer would only be temporary. Just as the Prof had mentioned, Eunice had mentioned, all those kinds of vouchers and what have you, these are temporary measures to help to alleviate the immediate pain, but it's not going to be a long-term solution. From our business perspective, because of our DNA, we've been consciously looking for options to try to reduce costs. And only if we are able to have permanent cost reduction, we'll be able to provide cheaper options to our consumers. So let me just share with you some of the measures we adopt in Chang Cheng. The three main cost components in Chang Cheng are manpower, raw materials, and rental. On the part of manpower, we try to work to do more with less. And that's the reason why we have our central kitchen, whereby 80% of the food processing are being done at the central kitchen before the intermediate goods being dispatched to the stores, with only 20% final, at what we will call it, assembling or cooking at the store level. That way I can reduce the number of workers I have at the store, and also the laborers requirement of them having to cook a lot more at the store level. So that's one way we try to reduce the dependency on the manpower, and in fact allow me to pay them more as a kitchen helper rather than paying chefs. Chefs are notoriously hard to recruit and even more difficult to retain. Now then, secondly, on the rental part, that's the reason why we're working very hard to penetrate into the hawker centers, including we have just recently been awarded to operate the Jurong West Hawker Center. That, with the government help, we are able to operate a sizable facility with a number of stores. For instance, a hawker center is one hawker center that we will be managing, Jurong West, is equivalent to 5 to 8 coffee shops that I have. So in that sense, and the rental there are much cheaper than the typical coffee shops. In fact, it can be as much as just 1/10 of what it costs to operate a store in coffee shop. So that way we are able to carry on expanding, but at the same time, without having to outbid each other to try to secure very pricey premises. Then, and finally on raw materials. The raw materials part of things, we try to look for not only cheaper options, but alternative options. For instance, while we have meats, real meat, we are also working with parties to be the OEM for plant-based proteins that tastes almost just like the real thing. So we are able to then blend the two together, and depending on the price of the real meat versus the plant-based, we'll be able to adjust the combination in order for us to be able to sustain a certain price level for our offerings to our consumers. So these are some examples whereby we will find means and way to permanently reduce the cost, or rather, able to produce at a cheaper rate, and therefore be able to help the consumers.
In fact, it's very heartening to hear that the commendable effort on your part and on other operators' part to tackle this issue of costs, which ultimately if you can pass on any savings to the consumers, this is something that we should always try to do. Thank you so much for your effort, and on behalf of CASE, we'd like to thank you, all the operators, if they can, pass on these cost savings to consumers. We are all consumers, all right? Now, moving on to part 3, which is the outlook for 2023. No crystal ball, but we know that the Singapore budget for financial year 2023 is on next week. Now, there will be live TV and radio coverage of these budget statements. Now, a link to the live webcast of the delivery for these budget statements will also be available in the Singapore's Budget website. Now, with that in mind, I have got some questions for all the panelists. What new measures or initiatives do you think would be announced to help consumers and businesses deal with these rising costs? Now, what is your personal wish list? Now, is there anything that you hope to see in terms of the support for consumers? I'll start off with Eunice.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned, right, more money never hurt. More vouchers, rebates, subsidies, any form of relief, especially for the elderly, maybe students, and of course, your lower income consumers, all that could help to maybe defray the cost of education, rising cost of, raising kids and all that. And all that could make a huge difference. Yeah. So that would be, my wish list.
Great. Okay. Yes, for Erik, anything from you? Personal wish list? Anything that you think the government can do in order to help you as a business
like
to deal
I said,
with
it's in
this?
our DNA not to ask for too much. Because ultimately, as the politician will always say, it has to come out from somewhere. But what I can see is that, or rather, if there's something that I can ask for, is that whatever they are doing, and now, for instance, all the workfare supplement, income supplement schemes, silver support scheme, and so on and so forth. Those are very, very good initiatives. But they tend to be, although very targeted, but stand-alone. So let me try to use an example from our case to maybe illustrate. We are thankful to the government for giving us a lot of support, including automation. They have provided us automation subsidy for us to acquire machinery to automate at the factory. And some of these are very costly. Now, but the criteria for the amount of subsidy given quite often depend on the size of the company. For instance, it says, okay, you are of this turnover, this size, we will be granting you 50%, 60% subsidy. Whereas if you are a smaller company, we will give you 80%. Now, that's good and that's fair. If you look at it from one way. Now, on the other hand, what I would like to ask of is that more of an outcome-based kind of grant system, whereby we can package all this together, including the training and all this subsidy to train the workers and then the machinery for companies to come to the government and say, hey, look, I'm going to deploy this technology with this machinery, with this all these people that I would train to use, existing stuff that I would train to use, and therefore be able to generate a certain outcome. Now, then the quantum or the percentage of that grant should be contingent on that outcome, and in that sense, you will be paying, using tax money to pay for real outcome that will show that, hey, I'm doubling my capacity, or I'm reducing the number of people that I need to do something. So something more tangible and for which match the amount that the government is putting in. So in order to maximize the return, and from that successful experience, it can be then shared with others. And I'm sure that in that sense, it makes the investment more worthwhile, rather than for us to keep asking for the government for more and more money and more transfer. And often the case, we're not even sure how effective some of these machineries, or even if the machinery is good, whether they have the complementary workers to operate it effectively, so that it has the proper outcome. This is something that I would hope to see, rather than keep chasing more and more dollars.
Thank you. Now, lastly, from Prof, as an academic, what kind of measures do you think will actually allow and help consumers and businesses deal with rising costs? And as a consumer yourself, what is your personal wish list?
Well, I think I don't think there's anything I want for myself personally, but that's because, as I mentioned earlier, I much prefer a situation where you don't need to tax me personally to give me subsidies back. But what I am willing to pay taxes for is to actually help our low income groups and those on fixed incomes like retirees cope with this inflation and standard of living. So I think it's money well spent if you take some money from me and help those groups out a bit, because I think they really need help. The high inflation means a real loss in their standard of living. And of course, I think the government has already been trying to respond to that over the past year. We saw several times where they have revised and upgraded the quantum of support given to Singaporeans to cope with high inflation. But I think we can also still do more here, because high inflation may be persisting for some time. And I think one area to look at in particular will be some of these schemes we had, which I think Erik also touched on, like welfare income supplement, silver support. These are very important schemes because they pay out regular amounts to low-income workers and retirees. But the challenge with these schemes is that the payout quantum is fixed. And the payout quantum needs to be upgraded and revised when inflation goes up. And they were, in fact, revised recently, but those revisions did not anticipate this extremely bad inflation that we are experiencing now. And I think what we want to move toward, I hope in the future, is a more outcome-based, again, borrowing from Erik, a more outcome-based framework where the target is, I want to have these people have a certain standard of living. And if that is the case, that means that the payouts need to automatically move when the key cost factors that affect the standard of living also go up. Okay, that would be better than the situation I think we have now, where the payout is fixed at a certain level. It doesn't change for a number of years, and then all of a sudden we say, oh, we need to change them, and then we adjust them by 10 to 20%. It's better to have them continuously keep pace so that people's standard of living does not drop. Yeah, so that's my view.
Thank you. Now that we're in a brand new year, what trends do you actually expect to see in terms of consumers' behaviour, Eunice?
I think consumers will be more price conscious now. And for us, even when we write our stories, we are conscious of, the budgets, that we cater for, so that, people don't feel something is too indulgent, that they can't afford, right? And they will be more careful on where they spend their money. So even if I am willing to spend, right, say maybe for festive occasion, I would be looking out for something of good value, good quality or quantity. At the end of the day, my dollar must be well spent or stretched to maximize whatever I can possibly, whatever deal, whatever discount or anything that I can capitalize on. And in light of rising costs, I think that businesses might have to relook, if they haven't already done so, they would have to relook at their supply chain if they really want to, manage their ingredient costs and all that, because if a certain ingredient is not, is getting just too expensive from a certain country, talking about imports here, right? Like, then maybe, is there a local option? Is there, somebody anywhere else that, could provide something more of value that would definitely at the end of the day, I think when they do their, dollars and when they count their dollars and cents, it would actually make a difference. Because if you're buying in bulk, especially ingredients and all that, getting a cheaper option that is still of good value, good quality, of course, would make a huge difference to their bottom line.
Same question to Erik. Well, from a business point of view, what kind of trends do you see in consumer behavior in this new year?
For one, after post-pandemic, I think more people are lapping on the e-platform. So we would be, and the options many are being inundated with the options on the e-platform. So I believe some kind of authentic automation would help a lot. For instance, I'm hoping, for instance, the better use of your price cookies database. You have a tremendous pool of data for suppliers and so on. And I would very much love to work with you. This is I already have a pet project going on, whereby we have the algorithm, the artificial intelligence to be able to capture all the options, particularly for hawkers. For hawkers, they are less brand conscious, more price conscious. And so if I'm able to cull through the data and be able to find cheapest options available to them, inclusive of the transportation cost, then they will then be able to tap on and purchase at a lower price, and thereby reducing their cost of production for them. So this is something that I'm very eager to work with agencies like yourself and also the supermarkets and the wholesaler and so on. Right. So Chang Cheng itself currently, we leverage on our scale and we are really providing options to hawkers or store operators that we work with. So we like to extend that even further to cover even more people. The other major trend, I believe, like Eunice had mentioned, people are becoming more conscious about their wallet. So we are looking and working with parties and all that partners to provide incentives or help wherever we can. For instance, loyalty programs or work with the e-platforms to offer discounts and so on to the consumers. But we also, in our product offering, we have kind of fine-tuned it. I believe now people are more eco-conscious, all right, and they rather not have wastages. So we are reducing the portion, or rather optimizing the portion, and then at the same time, but improving further on the quality of the food product that we are offering to the consumer. So that way they don't have to waste, but at the same time they feel that they are having value for money.
Now, thank you so much for all your insightful sharing. We have come to the end of our webinar. Now, from our panelists, we have learned that, like I say, consumers, very important to make well-informed purchase decisions, consciously look out for cheaper options, and of course, cost-effective options as well, as a long-term solution to tackle all these rising cost issues and the problems that we have today. Now, Price Kaki is actually one of the ways that you can do this. In fact, let your fingers do the searching. Now, after all, we are all in it together as consumers. Now, we thank you once again for our panelists for joining us today and sharing their insights. And thank you for all the viewers at home for joining us. And have a good day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you again.
Okay.